so we could have a wonderful large lecture hall to host all of you. Good evening, and welcome to the 2016-2017 Lectures in Catholic Experience. And a very special welcome to any of you who may be here at St. Jerome's University for the first time. We are very happy that you could be with us this evening. And you know what? From here on in, I'm not going to worry about the snow because you all came despite the snow. So that's wonderful. I'm going to take that now as a positive omen moving forward instead of a problem. I want to extend a special welcome as well to Derek Haim and John Murphy from the Waterloo Catholic District School Board, which is supporting tonight's lecture. I want to begin by acknowledging that we are on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. This university is situated on the Haldeman Tract, the land that's promised to the Six Nations and includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. My name is Christina Vanin. I'm the Associate Dean here at St. Jerome's University, and I'm coordinating this year's lecture series. Before we get started, if you haven't already done so, would you please turn off any equipment that you have with you? Thank you. Page 2 disappeared. Well, isn't this interesting? Well, can I make it up from my memory?
Sure you can.
Sure I can. Well, I think what I was going to say in the introduction, it was about a wonderful homily that Pope Francis gave back in September. There are sources in his homilies for just about any introduction that you might want to do on just about any topic. So on that day, Pope Francis reflected on the scene of the widow of Nain from the Gospel of Luke. And there he says, there is an encounter there between people, an encounter between people who were on the street. And this, Francis said, is something unusual. In fact, he said, when we go into the street, we tend to think of ourselves. And so we see, but we do not look. We hear, but we do not listen. In short, everyone goes their own way, and consequently, people pass each other by, but they do not really encounter each other. And so Francis insists that an encounter is something else entirely. When Jesus comes upon this widow who is on her way to bury her only son, we hear that Jesus had great compassion for her. And this compassion is not the same as what we normally feel when we go out to the street, we see someone or something sad, and we think, oh, isn't that a shame? Instead, when Jesus sees this woman, he was seized with compassion. He drew near to her. He spoke to her. He said, don't weep. He involved himself with her and her sorrow. He drew near. He spoke. He touched the coffin. He touched the widow. A caress, because he was moved. Francis says this example of Jesus is important for us today, who are far too accustomed to a culture of indifference. So it's not enough to say, what a shame, and then move on. Instead, if we don't stop, if we don't look, if we don't touch, speak, we cannot create an encounter with another person. What do we do with this consistent, ongoing challenge by Pope Francis to be actively engaged in building a culture of encounter wherever we live? This evening, we are very honored to have with us Shane Claiborne, renowned activist, self-proclaimed recovering sinner. He's here with us to help us think about what it means to be Christ in our world. Shane graduated from Eastern University. He did some graduate work at Princeton Seminary. His adventures have taken him from the streets of Calcutta, where he worked with Mother Teresa, to the wealthy suburbs of Chicago. As a peacemaker, his journeys have taken him to some of the most troubled regions of the world, from Rwanda to the West Bank and he's been on peace delegations in Afghanistan and Iraq. Shane heads up Red Letter Christians, a movement of Christians committed to living out the lifestyle that is presented in the Gospels. He's also a founder of The Simple Way, an organization in inner city Philadelphia that has helped to birth and connect radical faith communities around the world. He is married to Katie Jo, a North Carolina girl who also fell in love with the city of Philadelphia and with Shane. They were wed in St. Edward's Church, the formerly abandoned cathedral into which homeless families relocated in 1995, launching the beginning of the Simple Way community and a new phase of faith-based justice making. Shane's books include Jesus for President. Now that's an interesting one to contemplate right now. Red Letter Revolution, Common Prayer, a liturgy for ordinary radicals. Jesus, Bombs, and Ice Cream. And his classic, The Irresistible Revolution, Living as an Ordinary Radical. And his newest book is called Executing Grace. Please join me in warmly welcoming Shane Claiborne to speak to us on the topic, The Scandal of Grace.
Well, it's wonderful to be here, just an honor to be with you tonight. And you came through the snow, and who knows, we might just make a whole night of this if we get snowed in. I came just a few days ago. I had the privilege of standing with our indigenous brothers and sisters in North Dakota at Standing Rock. I was there just 3 days ago, and it was a holy space as we got in the way of the pipeline and saw the incredible courage of these folks that have been camped out there. And it occurs to me, as Christina was sharing too, and as I thought of this week, that I think part of what happens in this life is we have holy interruptions, you know, and that story was an interruption. You look at half the Gospels and they're interruptions, right? Jesus is on his way somewhere and someone pulls on his shirt or says, my son's sick, or we ran out of wine at our wedding. Can you help a brother out? You know, like it just kind of interruption. And yet I think like in our world, we kind of have done a lot of work to try to not be interrupted, right? We like our daytimers and schedules and predictability, and sometimes I think we don't leave much room for the Spirit. So it was beautiful to be interrupted. Our community started as an interruption. I was perfectly content going to college in the suburbs of Philly, and then in 1995, back in the 1900s, there was an interruption, and it came out of the desperation of homeless families in Philadelphia. These courageous mothers, mostly mothers and children, were on the waiting list for housing. At the time, there were 3,000 families on the waiting list for housing, with nearly a over 10-year waiting list for affordable housing. Shelters were full. And so these families did something beautiful. They looked around North Philadelphia and they saw we've got 20,000 abandoned buildings. We've got more abandoned buildings than there are homeless folks in our city. They said, this doesn't make any sense. And then they found this building, old abandoned Catholic church building. And they said, this isn't just any building, this is a holy space. And so they said, we should be able to stay there. And they moved into it. And they began living there. And what I read back on my college campus was a newspaper article. The headline said, Church Resurrected. And it began with the story of how these families had brought this abandoned space back to life. And they almost 100 folks, women and children, were living in this space. And then as we kept reading, though, it ended tragically by saying that the archdiocese had given them an eviction notice of 48 hours. And if they weren't out within 2 days, they could be arrested for trespassing. Something about that just didn't feel quite right, and so we organized a caravan, and we went down and we found this building, and on the front of it they had hung a banner that said, "How can we worship a homeless man on Sunday and ignore one on Monday?" Come on, right? And they held a press conference and said, "In all respect to the archdiocese and officials, we've talked to the real owner of the building. And God said we can stay till we figure something else out." And it began to just captivate the attention of our city. And the media made it look like the church was kicking homeless people out. That's because the church was kicking homeless people out, and they organized a movement around this. And one thing after another happened. And it was amazing. It was where we woke up, and it was an interruption that did that. It was these families that evoked all of the incredible history of sanctuary, of seeking refuge, right? Of all of the also revealed the tragic way that so much of the church is often abandoned the most forsaken areas of our cities. And yet, as this happened, it was like it was a place where miracles were born. We had worship services inside of there on Sundays. And like Christina said, Kate, my wife, and I ended up getting married there. But it was one thing after another, because the church wasn't looking good. So they ended up kind of switching strategies, tactics a little bit. And they said, well, actually, it's a liability issue. We'll say it's not safe in there. There's a fire hazard. And I'm sure there was some truth to all that. But, they said, we're going to kick them out because they don't meet fire standards. And they brought in the fire marshal. But the night before, these firefighters came and they knocked at the door. And we answered the door, and there's all these firefighters, and we're immediately defensive. We're like, "Oh, please come back tomorrow. It's the middle of the night. The kids are asleep. We don't have any of our media friends here. Like, just give us a minute, And they said, no, listen, we're not here to kick you out. In fact, we know what's happening, and it's not right. So we're not exactly on the clock, if you know what I mean." They said, "We're going to help you walk through here and get ready for tomorrow, because our boss, the fire marshal's coming, and you need to be ready." So they helped us get fire extinguishers and smoke detectors and exit signs. And we worked all night, and the next day the fire marshal came, and all the media and the archdiocese officials, and the fire marshal walks through, and he goes, "This place is looking good. Y'all done pretty well." And he said, "I'm not kicking them out." What we thought was 48 hours turned into months and months. And it was never meant to be a permanent solution. We had one little makeshift restroom for 100 people. So it was an act of desperation, but it woke us up, right? It woke our city up. It brought forth the humanity and the faces and names of folks who are struggling in homelessness and poverty. It woke us up. And the way that it ended was they left the building voluntarily. The families left. Many of them had received housing at this point. Folks saw it on the news, and their hearts were moved. People donated houses. All kinds of things happened. And they left voluntarily. They marched to the mayor's office, and they said, "You have no idea what it's like to be a homeless mom with your kids and not know where you're going to sleep. But we want to invite you, get to know us. Get to know our names. Get to know our kids. They cry the same salty tears your kids cry. We're made in the image of God just like you are." And they said, "We want you to walk alongside of us. Walk in our shoes a little while." And they left that invitation to walk in their shoes. And they took off all their shoes, and they left them in a pile outside the mayor's office. And it's in the middle of that we were inspired by these families, but we started reading the Bible again, right? We started reading the book of Acts where it said that no one claimed any of their possessions were their own, but they shared everything they had. And there were no needy persons among them, right? One of the signs of Pentecost was at the birthday of the church was they ended poverty because they started holding their possessions with open hands, right? They loved one another in such radical ways. So we got excited about all that, and we're kind of young evangelicals, a lot of us, and we thought we were rediscovering this stuff for the first time in 2,000 years, and then we had some awesome nuns and stuff that came, and they're like, hey, we're around the corner. We just wanted to let you know we love what the Spirit's doing. And we've been doing community for a while, about 1,600 years. And so if you want to pick our brains, we're around the corner, And they came alongside of us, folks like my mentor, Sister Margaret McKenna, who's a medical mission sister. And she said she actually lived in the desert for a while in the Carmelite tradition. She ended up saying, I felt called to the city, though, and she began to live in the city. And she said, I figured out that the inner city, is the contemporary desert. This is where we find God and where we build a new society in the shell of the old one. This is where we see the same spirit of the desert fathers and mothers is here. And she says, I am just a really bad hermit. And she started opening her door, and now she says, I'm kind of like the little woman in the shoe that has so many kids, I don't know what to do. She has a recovery community with 50 folks that are recovering from drug and alcohol addiction. And she's one of my mentors, and she's one of those nuns that came alongside of us, and we realized that we're a part of this beautiful tradition, but we sometimes get lost, right? We sometimes get confused about what it means to be the people of God. I think of it's been said that sometimes our Christianity gets cluttered, right, by all the stuff of this world, and we forget who we are, that we every few generations we need a rummage sale in the church, so we can clean house a little bit and we can rediscover, the old treasures. And so I think that's kind of what we began to do as we started to visit communities like the beautiful communities here in L'Arche, and we visited Catholic worker communities. We kind of were out. We were like, we want to learn from anybody we can. And the other thing is the great thing about being 20 years old is no one's convinced you that anything's impossible, And so we were like, Mother Teresa's still alive. Let's go learn from her. So I always tell this story when we first wanted to work with Mother Teresa, everybody laughed at us, and we just wrote a letter and we prayed over the letter and sent it off, And every day I'd go like a kid at Christmas, to check my mailbox, thinking I'd have a letter from Mother Teresa, and that letter never came. But when you're 20, you're stubborn, and that didn't stop us, So I just started calling nuns and trying to get a number for Mother Teresa. And this one sister, beautiful woman in the Bronx, she gave me a number, right? And I called that number, and I called it from a payphone in our dorm lounge at my college. And I'm dropping quarters like there's no tomorrow, And young people, payphones were things that you used to use. Anyway, so we're I'm calling, and the quarters are going fast, and the phone rings, and I'm expecting a polite operator or something like Missionaries of Charity. How can we help you? And I just hear, hello. I'm thinking I got the wrong number, and I'm deep in the quarters at this point. So I'm like, hey, I'm calling from the United States. We're trying to get a hold of the Missionaries of Charity or Mother Teresa or somebody in Calcutta. We want to come over and work. And she goes, this is Mother Teresa. I'm like, that'll work, And I thought about saying, yeah, right, and I'm the Pope. But and so I said, we want to come work with you. And she says, well, come on. And I start thinking very rationally, where are we going to sleep? What are we going to eat? And when I ask her those questions, she just goes, God takes care of the lilies and the sparrows. God will take care of you. Just find your way here. I'm like, awesome. I hope that works with my mom when I tell her that, And but we went over, and we lived and worked in Calcutta, and things that I only read about in books. I worked in the home for the destitute and dying, Mother Teresa's first home. I worked there every afternoon. Worked in the orphanages every morning, and we had so many incredible experiences. And I think one of the things that I learned in India was how to pray, because I grew up in the Bible Belt, and I grew up thinking of prayer as like, we would take prayer requests, and everybody would say all the different things, and we'd bring our requests to God. I think that's a part of prayer, but in India, I learned something different. I think every morning we would start our prayers at 5 in the morning by kneeling before the cross, right? We'd go in barefoot and we'd kneel before the cross, and all the prayers seemed to be less about us trying to get God to do what we wanted God to do, and more about us becoming who God wants us to be and do what God wants us to do. And it was a different kind of praying, and these prayers that we prayed, it's so funny to me, now when some of my evangelical friends, they say, well, Catholics don't really believe in a personal relationship with Jesus. I'm like, Mother Teresa called Jesus her spouse. Doesn't get much more personal than that. But this love relationship, as we knelt before the cross, it was these prayers where that Jesus would so live in us. These are the prayers that we prayed. Maybe some of you know if you've been there, but that every person we come in contact with would feel the love of Jesus in our soul. That we would leave off the fragrance of Jesus by the way we live. Beautiful prayers, right? It's also why Mother Teresa wanted to have, she wanted Eucharist every morning, We're talking to one of the nuns, we're like, wow, every morning, this is pretty serious. She goes, yeah, you've heard the saying, you are what you eat, right? That's what we're talking about, right? We're praying that we would become the body of Christ to the world, that we would be digested, we would become this body, we would actually become the hands of Jesus, the feet of Jesus to the world we live in. So it changed the way I thought. And of course, Mother Teresa had that beautiful line. She said, Calcuttas are everywhere if we'll only have eyes to see. So pray that God would help you find your Calcutta. And we came, back over to Philadelphia, and we started our little community, and we're very inspired by the sisters. We started above our door, we had the saying of Mother Teresa. In fact, even the name of our community, The Simple Way. One of Mother Teresa's book is the Simple Path. And it's she used to say, following Jesus is simple, but that doesn't mean it's easy. And that's what we were after. We said, we're going to open our doors to folks who are on the street. And we began doing that compassion work. I think Mother Teresa radiates the compassion to lift people off the streets, to help kids with homework, to do all of that. But then there also comes a point, I think, where Dr. Martin Luther King said, we're all called to be the Good Samaritan and lift our neighbor out of the ditch. But after you lift so many people out of the ditch, you start to say, maybe we need to rethink the whole road to Jericho. We got to figure out what's landing people in the ditch to begin with. So we still do that work. Every week we give out food, and we plant gardens, and we paint murals. That's kind of what we do in our neighborhood. But we also began to get involved with the justice work. And I think compassion and justice have to go together, right? They are inseparable. And what that looked like for us in the early days was our city in Philadelphia began to pass really terrible laws that specifically targeted the homeless, right? And this has been done all over the United States. We've got a study of over 50 cities that passed anti-homeless legislation. And by that, I mean laws that made it illegal to sleep in public places, laws that made it illegal to ask for spare change. One law in Philadelphia that we found particularly challenging was a food ordinance that you can't feed folks. That was sort of the end of the line for us. We said we cannot not feed folks. When Jesus says, when I was hungry, did you feed me? We're not going to say, sorry, our mayor wasn't really down with that. And so we began to organize, public picnics and public sleep outs in these areas. And as some of you may know, we ended up well, it was interesting because we began them, we started very humbly. We would bring our guitars and drums and, sing some worship songs. And then we had someone serve communion, which was pushing the envelope a little bit. You weren't allowed to distribute food, and of course you're Catholic, it's not food at all. So we're all Catholic, and so, but we're, distributing the elements. And then after the communion, we kept breaking the bread by bringing in pizzas and stuff. And, all the cops are around. They're like, I'm not arresting them. I might grab a piece of pepperoni, and then like after that, we kept doing that week after week. And eventually the police were ordered to arrest us. So they swarmed in, and on all sides of the park, they came in, they arrested us, and like 30 of us were taken to jail. And that was a first for me. My mom wasn't really excited about that. It was not how I raised you. It's funny to me because like when I meet Christians sometimes, like there's so many of these wonderful redemption stories where folks are like, man, I was into all kinds of stuff, drugs and partying. I went to jail and then I met Jesus and, everything came together. I'm like, God bless you. I mean, for me, I was a great kid, straight A student. I met Jesus and that's where everything went crazy. I actually went to jail because of Jesus, and so anyway, we fought our case in court, and it was beautiful. We had one of our buddies, we decided we had all these great lawyers, which I love lawyers, like we've got great lawyers, but we decided we just wanted to be represented by one of our friends on the street. So our buddy Alfonso, he was a sweet talker, and so we were like, Fonz is perfect. So he's going to be our representative, We all knew him as Fonz because he's so cool. And so we go to trial, and like we're all praying. There's that verse that says, when they drag you before the courts, don't worry about what you're going to say because the Spirit will give you the words. We're like praying, Fonz, Lord, give him the words. And Fonzo stands up, and Fonz goes, Your Honor, we believe these laws are evil and wrong, and rest our case. Like, whoa. All right, Fonz, right? I had a shirt on that said, Jesus was homeless. First thing the judge does, he goes, Jesus was homeless. I didn't know that. I said, yeah, Your Honor, in the scripture, it says that foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. Jesus was homeless. There was no room in the inn. He was born in a manger. Jesus was a refugee. Jesus was homeless. The judge goes, you guys might stand a chance. And we did. As we went to trial, like the district attorney and the prosecutors, they weren't impressed by any of this, and they were throwing the book at us. They wanted us to go to jail and serve time. They wanted us to pay thousands of dollars worth of fines. Collectively, we had thousands and thousands of dollars worth of fines that we had been given. And so, and then they wanted us to have, this is the kicker, hours of mandatory court-sanctioned community service. That was the best part. Don't make us serve in a soup kitchen. All right. So, but we did. The judge ended up interrupting the whole court, and he said, you know what? What's in question isn't whether or not all these folks broke the law. It's very clear to me that they broke the law. They've been breaking the law. But what's in question are the laws that we're passing. These laws that are so hard for our most vulnerable people. He said, these guys are not criminals. They're freedom fighters. If it weren't for people who broke the bad laws, we would still have slavery. He said, that's what, from the Boston Tea Party, the Civil Rights Movement, we should know this. The Underground Railroad, he said, these guys are freedom fighters. I find them all not guilty on every charge. He dropped all of our charges. And pray that we keep getting that same judge, okay? So, because these laws just came up again. The laws just came up again. Like recently, there was a food ordinance in our city again that said if you feed more than 4 people, you could be fined and then face criminal, stuff. And so you're like, man, something about 5 was just too many, but we had these public hearings, and it was amazing because what happened was the church rose up to challenge these laws. As Dr. King says, the church is neither meant to be the servant or the master of the state. The church is to be the conscience of the world, right? We're to be the conscience, to wake people up. And so it was amazing. We when they started this law again, we all had our shirts. We had shirts that had like said on them, if Jesus had done the fish and loaves thing in Philly, he would have gone to jail, and we had all this stuff. And so we gather, and this woman, beautiful Pentecostal woman, she stands up and she says, 15 years ago, God told me to start making casseroles and taking them out to the homeless. I take them out every Tuesday night. Everybody meets me on the boulevard, and I give the food out, and now it's illegal, maybe. And if the mayor wants to stop me, then the mayor better talk to God, because God started all of this. And then after her, a Catholic theologian stood up and said so beautifully, when we feed the homeless, we don't believe we're feeding some pitiful, poor person on the streets. We believe it's a sacrament, that we're feeding Jesus. And to say that we cannot feed someone who's homeless is to say that we cannot feed Christ. It's a violation of our religious freedom as well. And it went all the way to a federal court that actually declared it is a violation of religious freedom to say you can't feed someone who's hungry. So I'm proud to be a part of that movement, that in Philadelphia we've seen now to the church that when it comes to this idea of grace, that we begin to see that we're not going to wait on politicians to tell us how to treat immigrants, right? We can see in the Old Testament to the New, we can see the Hebrew Scriptures saying, when you welcome the foreigner, you should welcome them as if they were your own flesh and blood, because you yourselves were once foreigners, right? That we see Jesus say, when you welcome the stranger, you welcome me. If you don't welcome the stranger, you don't welcome me. That's the words of Jesus, right? And so our city has a movement now, a new sanctuary movement that is welcoming refugees, and we have churches that are courageously rising up. I think you'll see a picture of one right here, the next one there, of one of the churches that have posted this banner on it that it says, of course we welcome refugees. We're Christians, right? And now a movement of hospitality houses and churches that are rising up. It's amazing. And I remember one of these churches, they had been doing hospitality, and the city came in. They said, oh, you can't do this. You can't do this. We don't know who all these folks are. They got paper. We don't know. You can't run a shelter. You don't have all the licenses and permits. And this is a Pentecostal church too. And you don't mess with Pentecostals, right? Like they said, listen, we're going to pray about this. Maybe we could meet in a week or so. And so they met back up in a week, and they said, we prayed about it, talked to God, and we want you to know that we're not running a shelter anymore. And the city was like, oh, great. They said, but we are still welcoming people, because that's what the church does. We're just not going to call it a shelter. We're going to call it church. We're going to call it a revival. We're going to have a revival every night. Our doors are open at 8 o'clock. We're going to start the revival, and it's going to go, Lord willing, to the next morning. And it was amazing. We went, the news was trying to cover these nuances, and it was hilarious, because they're like, yes, the pastor just said they're no longer running a shelter. They're hosting a revival. Back to you, Bob. And then they're going, they're like covering it. And we went one night to the revival, and there's like, all these folks that are packing this place out, and they start telling their stories, and we have a beautiful communion service in there, and we have songs from different traditions. And then after like 3 hours, one of the pastors goes, all right, that concludes our formal revival service tonight. The next 8 hours or so will be contemplative prayer and meditation. Go in peace, and everybody. And that is what I think when I read the scripture and it says we're to be as shrewd as serpents and as innocent as doves, right? That I see a movement even at such a time as this in our country, that even along the border of the U.S. and Mexico, where we hear a lot of talk about a wall, about sending people out back where they're from. We see the church rising up. I was in New Mexico, I think it was, and I visited a community there that they had created another sanctuary movement along the border, and they said, yeah, we've got lawyers that can help folks pro bono, if they need documentation. And they said, but we also decided we need to bear witness right now. This is a time of prophetic witness, that we need to be the church and shine a light in the darkness. And so they told me the story of how they had organized cross-the-border communion service, right? So they had folks on the Mexico side that walked to the wall, right? And then they were met on the U.S. side with folks met on the other side of the wall, and they sang each other's songs back and forth in Spanish and in English across the wall. And then they decided one day, they said the Spirit moved us so much, we decided we wanted to serve each other communion. So we just threw the bread over the wall. I know it's not very Catholic, but it's beautiful, right? You see that, like this community that said our love refuses to stop at walls. Our love does not honor borders. Our love is boundless. What's born of the flesh is flesh, and what's born of the Spirit is spirit. That we have an allegiance that runs deeper than nationality or biology. If someone is suffering on the other side of a wall, it's as tragic as if it were our own flesh and blood, our own mother or daughter. And so I love that. I think this is an amazing time for us to be the church. And you should be praying for us in our country, you know, as we seek to be faithful right now. And it's a troubling time, you know, but this isn't the first time we've seen that. I can remember right after September 11th, it was deep living in Philadelphia because we're sandwiched between New York and D.C. Almost all of us knew folks that were affected by the horror of the attacks on September 11th. And I can remember the ways that people tried to process their pain, right? And their anger, their fears. And one of the things that happened in Philadelphia is someone dropped a banner from City Hall, from our city building downtown, and it said, "Let's kill them all and let God sort them out." So there were those expressions, but there were others. I remember hearing about a group of folks who were directly affected. So they lost their husbands, wives, daughters, and mothers and fathers in the attacks, their spouses, and they got together originally to grieve together. But then as they began to see the onslaught of the war, their prayer became, "Our grief is not a cry for war. Please don't kill in our names." That group became known as Families for Peaceful Tomorrows. They're an inspiration to me. And I heard the stories of them going to Iraq and Afghanistan as peacemakers. And it looked like Jesus, right? It looked like that message, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they are the children of God." But Jesus said, "Love your enemy." I became pretty convinced that that means we shouldn't kill them. You know, that Jesus' call seems like a big one, though. You know, like what does it mean to love our enemy, right? In a world of ISIS. Well, I think probably the same thing it meant 2,000 years ago when people were feeding Christians to beasts and hanging us upside down on crosses, right? Like, love your enemies seems like a pretty lofty command. And yet I think as I've tiptoed into that, I've become convinced that it's the only way, right? That I grew up, my dad was a Vietnam veteran. I grew up, you know, this fusion of God and country. And yet when my first trip to Iraq was in March of 2003. So this was actually a direct action against the military bombardment. So it was in March was the shock and awe campaign, was during the bombing of Baghdad. And I was there with an amazing group of people, many of them deeply committed to their faith, pastors, nurses, doctors, veterans that were all there to say no to the war and to say yes to our brothers and sisters there. And so we were living among the Iraqi people in Baghdad as the bombs fell. Saw some of the most horrific things I've ever experienced in my life. But I also had my eyes open to grace in a way that I can't even hardly conceive of at the time. I remember one of the services, right as the bombs started falling in Baghdad, there was a worship service to pray for peace. And so we, packed out this little church building in all different denominations, like Catholic, Protestant, Syrian, like all kinds of different Christians were together. All the bishops were there, and we and they made a declaration that they had written together, the bishops, right? And it basically said, addressed to Muslim people, and it said, "We want you to know that we love you, and that we know that you are created in the image of God, that we come from the same dirt of this earth that God breathed life into." It said, "We come from the same dysfunctional family of Abraham and Sarah, and we're praying for you right now." And I was so moved, as this happened. One of the bishops points to the cross, and he says, "This cross doesn't make any sense to the wisdom of this world, the way that we've been conditioned to think, but the cross teaches us what perfect love looks like when it stares evil in the face. Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing." That we see in Jesus a way that we can interact with evil without becoming it. And this cross is everything to us. And so after that, everybody busted out an Amazing Grace in Arabic. My Arabic's not great, so I kind of hummed along, But then, I'm got tears rolling down my face, and I kind of beelined up to the altar afterwards, and I grabbed one of the bishops, and I'm so excited, and I get a little like. Well, you can tell, so I go to the bishop. I'm like, this is amazing. I can feel God in this place. And then I said something ignorant. I go, "I had no idea there's so many Christians in Iraq." And he goes, "Yeah, this is where it started." And he goes, points out the window, right? And he goes, "It's the Tigris and the Euphrates. Have you heard of them?" He said, "The Garden of Eden's right down the street, man. This is where it all started." He said, "You go back and you tell the church in North America that we are praying for them. We're praying for them to remember who they are." And those words, echo in my soul. And then my last glimpse of Iraq in 2003 is as we were leaving Baghdad, the bombs were still falling, and we're driving through the desert from Baghdad to Amman, Jordan. And very treacherous journey through the desert. And at the time, it was even worse than usual. I mean, there's bridges down, there's cars on fire. And we hit something in the road that popped the tire of our car, and it spun our car off the road. Our car flipped over, and all of us were injured. Thankfully, no one was killed, but two of my friends had head injuries, and so we're trying to get them out of the car. The car's on its side, so we're, lifting everybody out of the side of the car. We get to the edge of the road, and at this point, we have absolutely no idea what we're going to do, and so we're praying, "God, do something. We need your help right now." We're sitting on the side of the road, and this little car starts, kind of petering down the road, and the first car that passes us, they stop. These Iraqi guys jump out. They wrap their arms around us. They can tell that we're in desperate need of help. They take us into their car. They drive us into the nearest town, a little town in the Anbar province called Ruta. Little town of like 20,000 folks. And so when we get there, I mean, it's big news. The whole town starts gathering. They're bringing us presents and blankets and food. We're like, we kind of need a hospital. And they get us there. And we get to the hospital. The doctors come out and they throw their hands in the air and they start naming everything that's been bombed in their town. And then they said, just 2 days ago, one of the bombs hit our hospital. He said it fell on the children's ward. So the entire hospital is closed. And, we could see our hearts sink. And we said, "Well, what do we do?" He says, "Oh, don't worry. We'll still take care of you. We're just explaining why we can't do it in our hospital." He set up a shanty clinic with a bed for each one of us. They literally saved my friend's life. They nursed them back to life. And one of them had gone into shock. And I mean, I'm so moved by all this, that my American mind starts to go towards money, and I'm like, we got to pay them, So I get all of our money in this huge pile of Iraqi dinar. And I go to give, I said to the head of the hospital, I said, "We just want to say thank you." And he goes, "Then say thank you." He says, "Keep all of your money. Keep all of your money. We don't want your money." He says, "All we want you to know is that we love you." And he said, "When we saw you, we saw our own flesh and blood. We hope that if you found us wounded in a ditch, you would do the same thing. All you can do to repay us is tell the story of what we did. So we've been telling that story for a while. And in fact, it was so inspirational to us that we ended up having one of our communities in our network name themselves after that town, Ruta House. It's down in Durham, North Carolina, down south near where I'm from. And it's always been our dream to go back, but it's not really easy to go back to Iraq. But we managed to. Just a few years ago, we jumped through all the hoops and and got permission to go back. We drive back that desert road and we get back into Ruta, and I mean, you would have thought we were royalty, right? They had found all the doctors that had saved our lives 10 years ago. They gathered the whole town, all the elders, the sheikhs, the religious leaders, the civic leaders. They were all together. They paraded us in. And one guy looks at me and goes, "You got to understand, we don't get many visitors. This is big." And then one guy says, "You should know there are a few people that are not happy about this, and they want to kill you, but it's only a few." And then they slept by our beds with AK-47s, and I'm like, this does not fit into my theology of nonviolence, but I must say I'm so grateful for your hospitality, and so there we are. And then they're like, we embraced these doctors and we told this story again, and they said, "Our mayor needs to know this." So he took us to the mayor's office, and the mayor's there, and he comes out, very dignified, and he with a beautiful entourage of folks, and we tell the story about how these doctors had saved our life. He's moved, and he says, "This is the stuff that heals the world. We don't need more bombs and drones and military. We need more stories like this." And he said, "We need to keep things like this going. So we want to be a sister city with a city in the United States." And I'm like, "Philadelphia." I said, "It's the city of love." And the mayor goes, "No." Right. He says, "It's too big. We're a little town. We need a little town in the United States." I'm like, "All right, mayor, all right." And he gets a translation. He says, "I've only been to one place in the United States. It's a little town in North Carolina, and it reminds me of Ruta." He said, "It's Durham, North Carolina. Have you heard of it?" I'm like, whoa, one of those spirit moments, right? I'm like, "You got to understand, we got a community called Ruta House. It's in Durham." And the mayor goes, "Then it's done." And then the mayor says, "We will have a community in Ruta, and we will name it Durham House, and it will be committed to peace and reconciliation." So I am convinced that Father Dan Berrigan was right when he said, too often it's not that we've tried the cross and it's failed us, but that we really haven't tried the cross. The way of the cross with the same courage, the same imagination. And so I think it's these moments, these few moments where we've experimented with the real gospel of Jesus, and we've found it to be so true, to be the solution to so many of the problems, all the problems of our world. And I think right now we're living in a time that's absolutely starved for grace and for mercy and the beautiful fruits of the Spirit. We see in our country, I think in the U.S., we see what happens to a country that has forsaken the beatitudes of Jesus. Blessed are the merciful, blessed are the meek, blessed are the poor, blessed are the peacemakers, the pure in heart. You look at those things and you look at the phenomena of Donald Trump. And I think I say the phenomena because this is much bigger than a man, I think. This is, I think, what happens to us as a society when the fruits of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, those beautiful things, goodness, gentleness, right? When we lose track of those and we make idols out of wealth and fame and power, that's what happens to us. So I think we need a witness right now, not just in the United States, but I think here and all over the world, that I think there's a world that is hungry for Jesus, hungry for love and for grace. And one of the things that began to catch our imagination is, do you have the pictures up there, brother? You guys, I wanted to show you these because, okay, that was the picture before. Thanks, that's cool. There it is. But go on to the next one. One of the things that's began happening is this is, we've seen the church begin to lament, right? And I think part of what we need is to begin to lament publicly the tragedy of violence and of racism and hatred. So this congregation has a T-shirt for every child, every person that was killed in our city. Their name is on it. You know, I mean, I know I'm in Canada. Everything's wonderful up here, but we have one homicide a day almost in Philadelphia. You know, it's about 90 a day in our entire country. So we're having 30,000 lives that are lost to gun violence. And so as we're imagining, what does it mean to be peacemakers? What does it mean to be the church in our country? We've begun to see these public laments, but we're also inspired by the beautiful text of Micah and Isaiah, right, of beating swords into plows, right, of transforming a world of violence, turning from violence to life. And so we got inspired by this. And you'll see a couple of pictures here of what we've started doing is we took our liturgy into the streets, right? So let me just tell you, like, one of those, you know, we hear these statistics and they can be overwhelming, but these are not just numbers, they're names, right? And I can remember one night about midnight, we heard the gunshots and I came outside and a young man had fallen on my steps and he was still alive. And so I was holding his hand as the ambulance came, and he's been hit by several of the bullets, and praying for him. And then the ambulance came and we found out the next morning that he had died. His name was Papito. He was 19 years old. And it was right after that it was during the season of Lent. And so we decided what we would do is begin to take our liturgy into the streets. And this was our Good Friday service. The young men in my neighborhood carried the cross, and we carried it in front of the gun shop that is just a few blocks from our house. And this isn't just any gun shop. It's important to note this is like one of the worst gun shops in our country for guns that have been sold there, tracked to violent crimes on the street. And so we specifically began to vigil outside of it. The American flags you have, or you see there, are some of the pro-gun advocates that are in an opposition to us being there. But what happened, I think, was we went from protest to public liturgy, right? And we read the passage from the gospel of Jesus's violent execution and the grace that was still on his lips. We read the passion narrative with the women weeping at the foot of the cross. And then we invited that Good Friday the mothers that had lost their kids to tell their stories and their tears. Something incredible happened, right? Transcendent. It was like the Calvary met Kensington, right? The gospel landed on our streets. And I can remember after that service, we even had some rabbis that showed up and they said, we don't usually come to a Good Friday service, you know, but we're really glad to be at this one, you know, and it was a solidarity. And we heard these moms. And then afterwards, this one mother came up to me. She's got tears rolling down her face and she says, I get it. I get it. I said, what? She said, God understands my pain. God knows what it feels like to lose your little boy. And then it struck me that it was Papito's mom. I actually didn't know her very well. And I think that's the power of the gospel when it connects to the world that we live in, right? God understands my pain. God knows what it feels like to lose your child. Some of the best theology I think I've ever heard, right? And so it was after that we began these transformations where we invited some of these mothers and fathers to be a part of transforming weapons. And it's amazing what you can do with social media, you know, like in a country with 300 million guns. We just invited people, hey, if you've got guns, we're accepting donations, right? And people started sending us their guns, which was awesome. You'll see one of them here was an AK-47. One of the first ones that we got was an AK-47 that you'll see a before shot, a couple more here, that of what it looked like. And we chopped them up, right? So we took this AK-47 that you'll see in the next picture here, and that's what it looked like before, and we turned it into a shovel and a rake. So check this out, this next shot. It's great, right? And then it was so like contagious. Like we started getting images from all over the place of folks that had turned, guns into stuff. So this guy made a guitar out of handguns that he's playing here. And this other fella, actually an image from, you'll see him playing it in the next one there. And then we got one, actually, I think it was Canada Mennonite that they sent us a picture of this fella in Mozambique that had made a saxophone out of a semi-automatic, right? Unbelievable. And then we got this image that was very special from Iraq. So these are my friends in Iraq, right? And they decided we're going to pour guns into the streets and crush them and run over them with steamrollers, right? It's so beautiful. Like they got excited about that. They said, and we want the kids to lead the way. A child shall lead them. So you'll see a kid driving the bulldozer and his mother is with him, don't worry. But they're crushing the guns. And now we've begun to do those all over our country to invite people to turn from death to life, to resist this culture of death and turn towards life again. This is one of our most powerful ones. Recently, we took a handgun that we found in one of the abandoned houses in Philly. And the mothers and fathers that had lost their kids came up and they began to beat on this gun, and we've heated it up in the forge. And this one mother that you'll see here, she's got a picture of her little boy that was killed in a terrible random shooting at a movie theater. And she took that hammer, and with every strike of the hammer, she said, "This is for my boy." And that day we turned that gun into these tools that we're able to use in our gardens. It felt like we were participating in the holy work of God, right? The redemption story that God is healing and saving this world, that we get to be a part of that. We get to be a part of that story, right? And I think that's one of the most amazing miracles in the world, is that we, like, for some strange reason, God doesn't want to change the world without us, that we are invited to participate. As we remember in this season of Advent, that it's about, when a mother is pregnant, you don't just passively wait, but it's an active waiting, right? That you are eating nutritiously, you are preparing, you are painting a room and getting it ready, you are expecting a baby. And I think in so many ways, when we are expecting a new world, we begin to live differently, right? We begin to participate in transforming weapons. We began to someone has said we are midwives of a new world, that we are giving birth to something. The scripture says that the entire creation is groaning, as in the pains of childbirth, that there is a labor happening. It is work and tears and blood, and life comes after that, through that. And so I want to pause as we're going to open it up in just a second. I know I've laid a lot out there, but I thought, as I was thinking about tonight, there was this one moment where my friend in Iraq heard the kids in Iraq. They were singing a song, and he is a musician, so even though they were singing in Arabic, he recognized it, and he quickly grabbed a recorder, and he began to record these kids singing the beautiful song, "We Shall Overcome." So I want to play that for us as we kind of center ourselves, and then we're going to open this up for conversation. But listen to the beautiful voices of these young people in Iraq.
نحن نمشي يدا بيد نحن نمشي يدا بيد نحن نمشي يدا بيد اليوم في أعماق قلبي أنا أؤمن نحن نمشي يدا بيد اليوم نحن لسنا خائفين نحن لسنا خائفين نحن لسنا خائفين اليوم في أعماق قلبي أنا أؤمن نحن لسنا خائفين اليوم We shall overcome We shall overcome We shall overcome someday.
Amen.
So Shane has agreed to take questions. So we have 2 microphones down here and 2 for those of you up there in the bleachers. We've got 2 microphones up there. So I'll let Shane manage that, and feel free to come up and ask and start some conversation.
Sir, got what we call charisma. Have you ever thought of other ways? I know you're busy. You do a lot. Have you thought of magnifying it yet further? Let's run you for political office. Only said slightly facetiously.
That's real sweet. That's sweet of you. I don't know what to say to that. I think I'd make a really bad president. Oh.
Shane, you shared with us a little bit at supper about your experience at Standing Rock, and I was wondering if maybe you'd like to share a little bit more about what it felt like.
Yeah, thanks. Honestly, I think I'm still digesting it since it was 3 days ago, but I have had a lot of time, even when we were there, to mostly I just listened and I absorbed the beauty of what our Indigenous brothers and sisters called a ceremonial prayer camp of resistance. It was a place of prayer and of deeply rooted nonviolence in the face of very militarized police. And I'm going to be posting some videos soon of some of the police encounters where actually people are actually kneeling in prayer that are shot with rubber bullets. And you may have seen the one woman's arm. It looks like it's actually going to have to be amputated or is never going to be able to be used again. Another person's eye, I think they lost their eye through rubber bullets, and the police were spraying water on them and you know, sub-zero temperatures. And so and yet the resistance of this community, their deeply committed prayers, I learned so much. It's a historic moment in our country, really, where this hasn't happened since the 1800s, that this many different nations have gathered in solidarity as Native peoples. So there were 200 different nations represented, Native nations there at Standing Rock. Of course, while I was there is when the veterans came in too. So there was some really amazing healing that happened as Native elders and chiefs met with veterans and lamented some of our history of what we've done to Native people and just the culture of violence that our country's built on. And so there was a lot of healing, I think, that happened during that. The one moment that for me was mystical, really, was as 3,000 or 4,000 veterans came in. The original narrative was that they were coming as a human shield. So they were, I mean, they're in full, like bulletproof vests and everything, defensive. There were no weapons, no alcohol, no drugs, nothing. So there were no weapons allowed, but they came with defensive gear. And the thought was that they were going to be kind of the front lines of resistance. But the Native elders actually switched this. They felt this kind of the wind move a different direction. And so at the campfire that morning, or the sacred fire that morning, they said, we're actually going to create a circle around the encampment. And so all of us, from all the nations, from the veterans, all of our allies that are here, we want everybody to grab hands. The folks that were on horses came and led the procession, and everyone surrounded the entire encampment. This is some 10,000 or more people, holding hands. And so this wasn't like a 15-minute prayer circle. This probably took an hour, or longer to do this. And at really precisely the moment that we're all holding hands there, they made the pronouncement that the easement had been denied, and so the pipeline has been stopped, and the place, erupted. And so there were so many moments like that. There's another video you can see where the police are coming at the protesters, and an entire herd of buffalo come through. I mean, one thing after another. It was a very sacred experience for me, and I'm still, I'm just awed by the courage and the beauty of the people that I met there. And so we continue to pray for them. The oil company, as you may have seen, has said that they're going to continue building the pipeline and face fines each day. I think it's a $50,000 fine, but that's questionable whether or not that'll be able to happen. The metaphor I used is like, you can, if you drive without a license, you get a ticket, but if you keep driving, you end up going to jail. I think maybe you can't just pay a fee in order to deliberately break the law and go through this sacred space. So I think all the elders have really declared it as a victory, and we'll see what happens next. But they've asked everybody to kind of go back and continue the work where we are, and to continue to build relationships with First Nations peoples, and to listen and see how we might continue to build a movement of solidarity. But there's no doubt in my mind that this is an epic moment in our history, because I think what it's catalyzed is a unity that when there's other situations like this, I literally think that they can get 10,000 people there to be, on the front lines with them. So that was a beautiful experience. Yeah.
First, thanks, Shane, for coming back to this area. Do you remember a decade ago or so, it seems like, when you were here in Kitchener and speaking to us? You may not remember that, but I do.
I'll pretend I do. No, I totally remember being, in this area actually quite a few times. But yeah.
Anyway, it's good that you have that fire still, and to hear you. But I have a sort of hypothetical question. Maybe if you suppose that I'm in sort of midlife, spent a lot of time at the office, have a couple of kids, I'm part of a pretty active church. Has some outreach, but is maybe kind of static. If you came, what advice would you give to that congregation, or to me personally?
So a couple of thoughts for that I think the congregations that I see coming to life are ones that get outside of themselves, even in small ways, and I like how Karl Barth said we read the Bible in one hand, but we need to read the newspaper in the other. So I realize, here that the issues are different. Some of them are probably the same, like Indigenous peoples, First Nations struggle, our healing of our history, things like that. But the gun violence, the death penalty, some of those I know are very different here. But I think what all of us are called to do is to have a kind of a theology of place. And as one of my teachers says, we talk a lot, in seminary and stuff about exegeting Scripture, reading it in the context it was written. But we've also got to exegete our neighborhoods and our time, so that we locate the gospel in the space and time that we're living in. So what does it mean to be the people of God in this place? What are the principalities and powers that are destroying people's dignity and squashing people's hope? And those, I think, have different expressions in different places. But I'm also continually astounded by what happens when liturgy gets into the streets, and when, sometimes how little energy it takes to do things like a t-shirt installment for the people that died in our city, or post a banner that says, of course we welcome refugees, we're Christians. So I think some of those things we just need imagination. And I think the church suffers deeply from a lack of imagination, that sometimes we kind of get stuck in our ways. So I think, we need new ways of making the old things fresh. So I'm actually love liturgy, and I love the traditions. I also love, like, some of my friends that have done really creative things. There's a beautiful thing called the Advent Conspiracy. If you haven't seen this, it's taking Christmas back as a season for compassion rather than consumption. Good, right? And so part of what they did is a bunch of pastors that's began to rethink how we celebrate Christmas, and to do that in really creative ways. So they got countless stories on there. But one of my pastor buddies, his kids were talking about what they should do for Christmas. And they said, one of the kids said, well, for starters, we shouldn't get more gifts than Jesus got, and he only got 3. And one was myrrh. Who wants myrrh? But like, so they said, their kids said, we're only going to get 3 gifts, and the rest we're going to give away. And like, it was that kind of childlike imagination that sparked something that now has turned into a movement of, I think, some 6,000 churches that are rethinking how we celebrate this season of Advent and Christmas. So, yeah, and I think there's a lot of, new iterations of what that can look like. And I think we need to be close to the suffering. Part of what has happened is that we've let the momentum of our culture drive us rather than the gravity of the gospel, which I think the gospel takes us into the suffering, near to the suffering. Everything from suburban sprawl to, like, kind of our culture is pulling us out of neighborhoods where there's high crime or there's people that don't look like us. So I think we've got to challenge that and raise up a generation that is deliberately living in proximity to the pain of the world. And for some people, that's not intellectual exercise. They grew up there. But I think it's staying in touch with the pain of the world is a call for all of us. One of my friends is a musician. He wrote a song. It's got a funny line. He goes, life's been good. I've finally been able to move out of Jesus's neighborhood. And he's kind of making fun of that, way that we move out of the streets. But like, if we aren't living near to the pain, I think we begin to we lose the fire and the urgency of the call for justice. And there's nothing like living near to those who are hurting to keep that urgency alive. So those are a few thoughts. Thanks, brother. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing.
Yeah.
Thank you for your heart and for your honesty. I'm just curious. I've heard you 3 times now, and I appreciate it every single time. And I'm wondering how you keep these stories alive, because it's been years and multiple times and multiple audiences. And so how do you keep it real and alive within yourself ongoingly?
Well, I think that's really sweet of you. Did I tell you any new stories you'd never heard tonight? Yeah, a couple. And I think part of what part of it is I still have evangelical heart in the sense that I love talking about Jesus. I love talking about justice. And I see, just as I see a lot of discouraging things, I see people living with incredible imagination, and there's new stories, nearly every day in our life in Philly. So I think we kind of need to keep living into new stories. And a lot of what I've been working on, it's actually kind of refreshing to do this tonight because I've been traveling all over the country talking about stories of the death penalty and of grace and forgiveness. So even that kind of like felt like just a new extension of that, because what happened was I started giving my books away to people living in prison, and it made sense, and like didn't make sense to like send them an invoice. So and I got to know a lot of them, and their stories captivated me. Stories like a man that told me, I'm alive today because of the victim's family. They were Christians, and I did something terrible and thought I had no reason to live. And they actually convinced me of my own dignity. They argued against the death penalty. And he goes, I wasn't a Christian before, but you better believe I am now. Like I understood the power of God's love and grace. So like, I think those people, like they really keep things fresh for me. And things like, I think part of our call is to community too, so that we, just like coals of a fire, we keep each other warm. The way you put a fire out just by kind of spreading the coals, the embers out, and it dies. And so I think like I'm proud to be rooted in a community where I was actually going to sleep, and the chief at Standing Rock made a Arno Looking Horse. He made a call for people of faith to come to Standing Rock in solidarity. And my wife and my community said, you should go. I was like, all right, So I think, I was able to go. And so I'm thankful to have a community that encourages that, and yeah, but, and sometimes we get a courage from that we wouldn't get on our own. Like I think of some of the stories I told you tonight, like I never would have gone to Afghanistan, like by myself. I had 10 other friends that said, hey, we're going to go visit, we'd love for you to go. And so I think a lot of times I say like community is about surrounding ourselves with people who look like the person we want to become, so that they keep us moving that direction. So if you want to be courageous, you hang out with courageous people and they rub off on you. And that's what happened to me, like Sister Margaret, the 85-year-old nun I told you about. She is one of the wildest people I ever knew. So when people tell me like, oh, radical Christianity, intentional community, it's a great phase, I'm like, you need to meet my friend Sister Margaret, because she's been in the phase for like 60 years, and like she's never leaving. And she got really sick not too long ago, and I visited her in the hospital, and she gave me this very dramatic, this may be the end. They're saying it's real serious. So if I cross over, she said, I'll be on the front line waving at you when you get over there. I'll get it, and gave me this very dramatic thing. And then like a few days later, I called her community to check on her. I said, is Sister Margaret okay? And they said, oh yeah, she's great. She got better, and she got arrested at the Pentagon yesterday. 85 years old, So yeah, it's beautiful. Great. Well, yeah.
Shane,
you've
I
been
got a
patient
question
over
for
here.
you.
Yeah.
I get to talk to a lot of Canadians and a lot of Americans in my travels. I belong to a religious community. We're in different places. I also know a lot of people in this room. After the recent election, a country that prides itself in inclusivity and especially how we treat women on all kinds of different levels. I would say as a country, we were a little bit, I don't know, lost or hurt or frustrated or, confused. And, we're part of this North American community. And for many of us, our heart, kind of goes out to you and stuff, and we're wondering about the future with some anxiety at times. We're affected. First of all, I want to say what you do and how you speak about what you do with such passion and energy gives me hope. And I think it gives hope to a lot of Canadians. Thank you for that. Second thing is, can you talk a little bit about how we can help, in what's, coming ahead? with lots of talk about how we're, going to be treating immigrants in the United States, and, how people are being treated, and how certain representatives are being, called to positions of power who wouldn't be the first choice of people who are more inclusive. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, thanks, brother. Well, the first thing I would say is that I mean, it was a deep blow, I think, to a lot of my friends of color, black and brown, like Latino and African American brothers and sisters in particular, and um, but as folks, as I've listened to folks, I think part of what is it's important to acknowledge is that um, all of this comes on the back of a our first African American president, the most powerful movement for Black lives and civil rights in decades, and I think that what Van Jones and some other folks have called white lash. There's a backlash that's come from this that has brought out some of the worst hatred and acts of racism all over our country. It also it feels like there is an incredible courage right now, though. In just a few days, I'll be with 50 speakers and writers we're all going to gather at the Equal Justice Initiative down in Montgomery, Alabama, with Brian Stevenson, who's been called America's Mandela, and Bree Newsom, who took down the Confederate flag. Other folks we're going to be there together to kind of dream and scheme a little bit on how we can do that. So I'll probably know more in a few days, but I think we've been trying to give voice to this in different ways. You may have seen Tony Campolo, who's a Baptist evangelist and writer. He's a great brother, great friend of mine. He and I wrote a piece in the New York Times that was out a week or so ago, and we're continuing to try to get another message out there, but it is a very heavy time. My wife asked her third graders in the public school the day after the election. She said, let's just have a little space to share. Like, you want to share anything that you're feeling? And the kids, these were literally the things that they said. Is Donald Trump going to make us slaves again? Are my parents going to be sent back to Puerto Rico? I mean, these are literal quotes, one of them said, I have a friend who's Muslim. Will she still be allowed to live here? So I think there's a deep, these are 9-year-olds. So I think there's a very deep sense of the principalities and powers that we're up against. But I also and I get so much courage from people who have lived in struggle, like these indigenous brothers and sisters in Standing Rock. One of the things that I learned is that we should never give someone the power to make us hopeless, and that's a power that we give them. Likewise, I don't think we should ever have a president that gives us hope. I think as Christians, that's one of the really peculiar things that we do, is we have all of our hope is rested in Jesus, and one of my neighbors, it was amazing because when all the Wall Street was going haywire a few years ago, I was talking to him about it. He goes, oh, our people have been in a recession for a few hundred years. This is nothing new. We got each other. We've got God, we're going to make it through this. So I think it will embolden folks, but I think there definitely will be something like when Jesus said the wheat and the weeds are all growing together, and it almost feels like someone spilled Miracle Grow on it, and it's all going crazy right now. But I want to be with the wheat. I want to see the good things grow. And I think in dark times, light shines bright, and I think we'll see that as well, and we'll see incredible courage. Like we some of the stories I told you, I think that those are happening everywhere. And the courage of one person like Rosa Parks or Bree Newsom as she took down the Confederate flag. I think that courage is also contagious, and it's emboldening a lot of people in our country that are deeply rooted in nonviolence and nonviolent resistance. So we'll be doing a lot of things inauguration week in DC. You can pray for that. Well, I think we're going to have the biggest direct action against the death penalty in recent history. So we'll kneel down and pray for an end to the death penalty at the Supreme Court, which is technically illegal. And so we're ready to do that. But there'll be several other witnesses that will be happening. So you could pray for that. And yeah, don't let your cells off the hook either, you know. I think a lot of this stuff is kind of like stuff that's swept under a rug, and then every once in a while something pulls it up and you like realize, wow, we've actually never really told the truth about what we did to indigenous people, you know, here in Canada, or like we haven't fully healed the wounds of slavery. And one of my friends, Mark Charles, he's a native theologian. He says we all want truth and reconciliation, you know, like the beautiful work that's been done, you know, in South Africa and Rwanda and other places. But we first have to have truth before we can get to reconciliation. So I think what has been happening in our country is there's a lot of truth telling that's happening. And I think we don't yet see the reconciliation and healing, but I think truth sets us free. And so we'll keep, you know, speaking truth with love. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, one more. And then, by the way, I like really enjoy meeting people. Like signing books is just an excuse to meet people for me. So like if you didn't get to share, I'll hang out afterwards and we can have some coffee or hang out in the foyer. Go ahead, brother.
You spoke about ecumenism and interfaith cooperation coming about through your activism. What about people of no faith, or especially people who identify with the new atheism, or in other words, fundamentalist atheism? Do you have any stories of people cooperating with people coming from that perspective?
Yeah, thanks, man. So my first thought on all this is like, I think that as a Christian, I want to be the best collaborator in the world, you know, and I think for too often we've thought if I don't agree with someone, I can't work together with them. If they don't share my faith, what good can we do together? And I think the answer is a whole lot of good. You know, like there's a great story where the disciples come to Jesus and they say, there's a dude down the street doing miracles. I'm paraphrasing a little bit. You know, there's a guy down the street doing like miracles and prophecies, but he's not one of us. Should we tell him to stop? And Jesus says, no, if he's not against us, he's for us. And I think that's a beautiful thing, that like we should be very quick to see folks that may not share our faith that are doing redemptive work, and be quick to work together with them. And sometimes I think there's even more power when we work across divides. For instance, one of our big allies on the gun violence has been hunters against gun violence, that are gun owners for guns used for hunting, but that doesn't equal semi-automatic weapons on our streets. And so they've been really credible voices and all that. So I think, I also think we got to be careful to think that we know who's in and out. You know, I like how Sister Joan Chittister says, like one of the consistent things Jesus does is challenge the chosen and include the excluded. So when Jesus is saying things like to the religious elite, the tax collectors and the prostitutes are entering the kingdom ahead of you, I think it should challenge us to not be so quick to think that we know who's in and who's out, or to think that like God could never use this person or whatever. Like one of my friends said, God spoke to Balaam, you know, this Old Testament story, through his donkey. And so he said, you know, God spoke to Balaam through his ass, and God's been speaking through asses ever since. So like if God should choose to use you, then don't think too highly of yourself. And if you meet someone else and you think God could never speak through them, think again. Like God can make the rocks cry out. God can work through an innkeeper. God can work through pagan rulers. God can, you know, speak through a donkey. So I also like to say to my atheist friends, when they say I've rejected God, I like to say, tell me about the God that you've rejected. Because so often when I hear them describe the God that they've rejected, I say, I don't think I believe in that God either. Like I think that the God that I know is a God that is love, a God that says, who has seen God? But if we love one another, God is in us and among us. And I think sadly, too often the biggest obstacle to God has been Christians, who have a whole lot to say with our mouths, but very little to show of God's love. So I want to be a part of a church that looks like Jesus again. And I think many of you have set this tradition in the Catholic Church of, a consistent ethic of life, of an embodiment, a lifestyle Christianity. And what we've done, I think, in a lot of evangelicalism is we've turned Christianity into a belief system, like doctrines on paper. And doctrines are good things, but they're hard things to love. You don't read a doctrinal statement and be like, whoa, sign me up, So I'm glad we don't just have words on paper, but we have the word, made flesh. And now we're invited to be a part of that embodiment. So I think that's what we do. We live out God's love. We work with people who, regardless of what faith they proclaim or no faith at all, we can find some common ground to work together on that. That's what I would say. I think we do that. We do that in Philadelphia. I would be an idiot if I wasn't working together with my Muslim friends to try to stop the gun violence on our streets and stuff, or others. So yeah. Anyway, that's I also think we've got to lament the fact that in the church we have become very divided. We did this project called Common Prayer, and we looked at church history, and Jesus' longest prayer is that we would be one as God is one. But there's 35,000 denominations. I think I'm preaching the choir here. I've become a little bit more Catholic in my old age, but I think that's part of what we've got to heal, or some of the wounds of that. We've got so much division. So, and I'm really thankful for Francis, Pope Francis. He came to Philly, and it was beautiful to have him. And one of my friends wrote a really great article, though. It said, if you love Pope Francis, you're really going to love Jesus. It's one of the things that's so remarkable about St. Francis is that what he's doing is even remarkable at all, right? It seems like it. I mean, it is beautiful, but it is also it's what we should be doing, right? It's what Jesus did. It shouldn't be a news story to visit folks in prison or to wash immigrants' feet. That's, what I hope becomes just what Christians do. And I pray that, a generation from now, when people hear the word Christian, they think of Christ, and they think of love and the fruits of the Spirit. So may it be so. Thanks so much for having me.
So we want to finish up the formal part of the evening, and I'd like to begin by inviting forward Derek Haim, who is a superintendent of learning in the Waterloo Catholic District School Board, to formally thank our speaker on our behalf.
Well, Shane, I don't know how formal this will be, but I'm privileged to say a few words of thank you. Thanks for demonstrating what it means to foster a culture of encounter, not only with your words here tonight, but as we sat at dinner, I was really struck. You're kind of a big deal. You have a Wikipedia page and all these great things, but you wanted to know the stories of all the people around the table. And that really speaks to me of presence. It speaks to me of encountering the other, and you really demonstrated that. And you told us so much about your friends and the work you do that really speaks to that culture of encounter. So thank you so much for that. You're showing us what it means to be Christ in the world by your example. And so I thank you for that. I think everybody here wants to be a red letter Christian and wants to live that simple way that you speak of and that you do. Would that holy interruptions don't become interruptions, and it's the other things that are interruptions, and you've challenged us with that. So thank you. We will wake up more because of your words and deeds. Thanks for reminding us that it's in the contemporary desert is where we find God, and let us all recognize we're there, and let's look. Thanks for reminding us that our Christianity gets cluttered, and we need to do that house cleaning. Thanks for reminding us that God takes care of the lilies and the sparrows, and that God takes care of us. All we have to do is just come on over. Thanks for reminding us that we need to become what God wants us to be, and we need to do what God wants us to do. Thanks for reminding us that God doesn't want to change the world without us. He's waiting for us. Thanks for challenging us so much. And thanks for reminding us that we should really want to leave the fragrance of Jesus wherever we go. That's beautiful, and you've described the way to do that. Thanks for reminding us following Jesus is simple, but it certainly doesn't mean it's easy. And your way hasn't been easy, but we're certainly inspired. Thanks for reminding us we have an allegiance to something that runs deeper, and reminding us about that theology of place. I just want you to, I thought of Maya Angelou's words, do the best you can, and when you know better, do better. Well, I think you've challenged all of us. We know better now, so now it's up to us to do better. So thanks for challenging us and inspiring us. And I want to leave you with just saying that all that we want you to know is that we love you, and please send that love from us wherever you go. And thank you for being with us here tonight.
Thanks very much, Derek. So just some announcements before we finish up in here and have an opportunity to chat with Shane in the atrium. So first of all, I want to sincerely thank the Waterloo Catholic District School Board for their ongoing commitment and support for this particular lecture every year, and grateful that Derek and John could be with us this evening. We do send out regular emails about upcoming lectures and events here at St. Jerome's University. If you're not currently on our mailing list and you want to find out information about upcoming lectures and events, then please, when you get to the atrium, there's a little table, round table, and you can sign up, give us your email, and we'll let you know everything that's happening. Every year, St. Jerome's University is very pleased to present a program of speakers to the community, and we're glad that we can make them available to you free of charge. And we're so grateful for the generosity of so many partners and supporters that make that possible. If you too would like to support the lectures, there are some donation envelopes available in the atrium. Also in the atrium, there's lots out there for you to enjoy. There are a number of wonderful, fairly traded products available for sale in the atrium by our Social Justice Committee. So that's certainly something to think about as a different way to think about this season of Advent and Christmas. Our local independent bookseller, Wordsworth Books, is with us this evening. Please make sure to visit their table, and they do have copies there of the updated and expanded 10th anniversary edition of Shane's book, The Irresistible Revolution: Living as an Ordinary Radical. And I also think they have a few copies of the book Common Prayer. The next lecture in Catholic Experience takes place on Friday, January the 20th, and it's entitled Integration, Transformation, and Reconciliation: The TRC Calls to Action and Laudato Si. Sister Priscilla Solomon is a sister of St. Joseph of Sault Ste. Marie, and she is an Ojibwe of the Anishinaabeg Nations. She's been involved in the Catholic responses to the TRC calls to action, especially regarding terra nullius and the doctrine of discovery. She's been involved with her religious community's Faith and Justice Office, and she works with Kairos's response to the TRC. So in January, Sister Solomon is going to use her stories and experiences, as well as her personal integration of both Anishinaabe and Catholic spirituality, to reflect with us on what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to action and Pope Francis's encyclical have to say about transforming and reconciling our peoples here in Canada and human beings with the natural world. I also want to tell you about another important event coming up in January here at St. Jerome's. In the year 2017, our university is hosting a year with the St. John's Bible. This Bible is the first handwritten and illuminated Bible commissioned by a Benedictine abbey since the invention of the printing press over 500 years ago. So we have the privilege of having 2 volumes of a 7-volume heritage edition of this Bible with us for the year, as well as a number of framed prints of the illuminations that are in this Bible. So on January 24th at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, we are having an ecumenical prayer service to officially welcome the Bible to our campus. So you're welcome to join us here. We're going to be here in Vanstone Lecture Hall. And we're going to be gathering together with our colleagues from Conrad Grebel, Renison, St. Paul's, Waterloo Lutheran Seminary, and the larger community to celebrate this incredible work of art. Finally, I want to thank all of you very much for coming this evening. It's wonderful to have you with us as always. And I'm going to say thank you for spreading the word about these lectures. I wish you and your families the grace, peace, and joy of this blessed season of Advent and Christmas. Look forward to seeing some of you back here in January, but for now, have a safe trip home this evening, and until next time, good night.